I think it's almost possible to read this morning's Parsha as a self-contained kind of happy little interlude within the greater narrative of the book of Genesis. As I mentioned earlier, our hero Jacob starts with nothing and really comes out on top. And sure, he works for his father-in-law for 20 long years. And yes, there's plenty of tension and competition within his household. But compared to what comes before this story, his father nearly being sacrificed, his brother threatening to kill him, and what comes later on in this story, renewed near-death confrontation with his brother, the death of his wife Rachel, the rape of his daughter Dinah. This Parsha really is almost kind of like a little bit of a peaceful fairy tale. Yet I find myself getting a little bit caught up on this character of Jacob's father-in-law, and also incidentally his uncle, Lavan. After all, if it is Jacob who becomes Yisrael, the father of what will be Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, that makes Lavan the grandfather of the Jewish people. And despite his holding such a prominent branch on the family tree, few characters in the Torah are as villainized and vilified as Lavan is. There are layers of destructive behavior put onto Lavan directly in the text. He has his own conniving nature, his desire to work Jacob to the bone for little or no money, his threats to Jacob and his family. And of course, as the Midrash likes to do, they add other sinister details to his character, taking even textual details that could be perceived as positive on the text level, greeting Jacob with an embrace and a kiss, and imbuing them with evil intent, explaining that this hug and kiss don't come from a place of love, but rather Lavan, who had been showered with gifts by Isaac's servant, couldn't believe that his son Jacob would show up empty-handed. And so when he's hugging Jacob, he's hugging him to see if he has jewels secreted away in the pockets of his clothing. And when he kisses Jacob, he thinks that he might have, when he didn't find any jewels, he thinks he might have some pearls hidden away in his mouth. And so even these kind of innocuous and possibly even loving and familial gestures, the rabbis decide to kind of turn into small microaggressions and acts with evil intent. But all of this, I think, pales in comparison to what is perhaps for many of us the best known mention of Lavan. And I'm going to read it first in Hebrew, and we'll see if it rings a bell for anyone. Say ulmad, ma bikesh Lavan harami lasot le'Yaakov avinu. Sheparo lo gazar ela al hazcharim ve'Lavan bikesh la'akor et hakol. Go out and learn what Lavan the Aramean sought to do to our father Jacob. For Pharaoh decreed a death sentence only on the males, but Lavan sought to destroy everything. That, of course, is pulled directly from the Passover Haggadah. It's buried a little bit in the Maggid section, and therefore it might be one of those quotes, one of those rabbinic insights that is pretty easy for us to pass over in our annual reading of the Haggadah. But really, I've always found it to be a head scratcher. When we're recounting the story of the Exodus, of hardening of hearts, and Pharaoh's own evil and attempted destruction of the Israelite people, are we really implying that Lavan, the grandfather of those same people, is more intent on destroying them, is perhaps more evil than Pharaoh himself? It might not be just about evil, but Lavan does pose an existential threat to Jacob and to the dynastic lineage of Abraham and Isaac. What perhaps makes Lavan so dangerous is how similar he and Jacob actually are. After all, Lavan is not just Jacob's father-in-law, he's also his uncle, his mother's brother. And even today, with some science and perhaps a little bit of just tradition, we say that sons tend to represent their mother's brothers. That's most traditionally ascribed to hairlines, but I think often we see it in personalities as well. Jacob is very different than his father. He's very different from Isaac. Isaac never leaves the land of Canaan. He's pure, and he's never tempted. But Jacob leaves, and in his battle of trickery and material and the chase of material wealth with Lavan, he almost never goes back to Canaan. We see this play out in chapter 31. Jacob is fighting with Lavan's sons over inheritance. He is practically one of them, right? He's just on this kind of liminal edge of, am I one of Lavan's sons or not? Because he is kind of taking part of the inheritance, and Lavan's actual birth sons are resenting that. And it's only once we see this conflict come to the fore that God steps in verse 3 and says, the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers where you were born, and I will be with you. Implying that perhaps if Jacob were to stay any longer with his uncle and father-in-law in Haran, God and Jacob could wind up abandoning each other. That there's this moment when Jacob is almost closer to being Lavan's son than he is to being Isaac's son. And he's just kind of teetering on that point of no return. And that's where Lavan's potential for destruction really is. It's not about wanting to throw babies into rivers like Pharaoh did, or to cut off the line. It's really about wanting to incorporate the line, almost wanting to adopt this figure of Jacob who is so like him, and therefore kind of cut off the entire lineage from Abraham and Isaac. And I think in there's a simple but potent message about not losing sight of our long-term goals, not getting too caught up in amassing the physical in place of the spiritual wealth, and ultimately about the importance of return and knowing where exactly it is we came from and where exactly we might want to get back to and why, and really avoiding